You are listening to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, a project of the University of Texas and War on the Rocks. My name is Ryan Evans. I'm the publisher of the Texas National Security Review, which you can check out at TNSR.org, and I'm the editor-in-chief of War on the Rocks. The third issue of TNSR is now out, and we're going to be doing podcast episodes featuring the authors of the articles in that issue. In this episode, I spoke to Julie Smith, the outgoing senior fellow and director of the Transatlantic Security Program at the Center for New American Security. She's heading an ambitious new program that involves interacting with the American and European publics about the transatlantic relationship and foreign policy in general. She's also got an exciting new gig in Germany that she'll tell you all about. So what made you choose to do this project? It's not the sort of normal think tank project. Or it's becoming more normal, but it's not a traditional think tank project.
Well, I think after the 2016 election, we were sitting around wondering kind of what the future of think tank work in Washington should look like. And we were asking ourselves that question in part because we knew we would have a new administration coming into office that had ultimately declared a lack of interest, to put it diplomatically, in elite think tank work, or any think tank work. And so there was kind of this existential crisis. What should think tanks be doing in the era of the Trump administration? And then that was paired with another question about how were we all on the left and the right and the center so surprised by this election outcome? And what does it say about our own isolation? And shouldn't we be somehow doing more to address the disconnect between Washington and the rest of the country? So we put our heads together and after a couple of months decided to launch a new project that would take us outside of Washington, which of course is not what we normally do. Normally, those of us that work in think tanks in this town spend a lot of time talking to other people in Washington, or we travel overseas and meet with allies and partners around the world to talk about U.S. foreign policy. So this is a completely new project for us, and it's been quite the adventure.
And what are the cities you've gone to so far again?
So far, we have gone to Tampa, Pittsburgh, and Salt Lake City. We have plans to go to Grand Rapids, Michigan this summer in my home state. And then from there, that's our first 4 cities, and we'll do 8 more over the next 2 years.
How are the questions that you get at these sorts of events with these audiences different from when you hold an event, for example, here at the Center for New American Security?
Well, they're not as different as you would think. Obviously, we're not getting into technical debates about the pros and cons of a particular ballistic missile. We're not debating the finer points of the national security strategy. But what we have found is that we can get some pretty sophisticated questions by Americans out beyond Washington on everything from North Korea to NATO to Russia, Latin America, the list goes on and on. So we've been surprised in the sense that I think sometimes there's an impression here in Washington that people are a bit disconnected. To be sure, not everyone is tracking foreign policy to the degree that many of us here in town are, but people are interested in foreign policy and national security. They have hard questions. They want to challenge our assumptions. And we have definitely gotten into some fairly detailed debates about U.S. policy in ways that I think have surprised all of us.
And you have some Europeans along with you on this roadshow as well, right?
Yeah, so on every trip, we take 2 Europeans and 2 Americans, and the project is funded in part by the German government and a German foundation called the Bosch Stiftung. And that doesn't mean we just take Germans. We take Europeans from various countries across the continent. And we've had ambassadors, we've had former ministers, we've had kind of think tank analysts, and kind of a whole array of foreign policy experts, some based here in Washington if they're an ambassador, and many based in Europe.
It's fair to say that you're a role model in this town for a lot of younger people coming up in national security, so I'd love you to tell us a bit about your career, how you got started, and how things progressed.
Well, my story in terms of how I got interested in Europe in particular, and then foreign policy more broadly, goes back to a simple high school exchange program. in the good state of Michigan, where I grew up, I decided to spend a summer in France. And I was a Francophile, and that definitely whet my appetite. I was interested in what I discovered in France at a young age, a country that seemed to be somewhat similar to the United States and yet oh so different in many other ways. And then from there, I did another study abroad experience in college. I went to the Sorbonne, then to the University of Munich. And through these experiences, first studying and then working in Europe, I became very interested in how I could use some of my skill sets. I realized I like to do research, I like to write, I like to do public speaking, and I became very interested in policy. And so I wanted to apply that skill set in kind of a policy atmosphere. And so off to the races I went. So I encourage young people to go abroad, whether it's to do some election observing or join the Peace Corps or study abroad, whatever it is. I think it's a great chance to get outside your comfort zone, learn something about the world. And it's very different than just traveling somewhere for 2 weeks. I mean, when you really plop yourself down somewhere for a couple months or a year, it can be a real learning experience.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I used to live in London and used to see a lot of definitely some differences, but a lot of strong similarities between the United States and Britain. I've been spending more time in France and with the French lately, and I wonder if actually they're not a lot more similar to us than the Brits are. What are your thoughts on that?
The French and the Brits. Well, it's hard. I could probably make lists on both sides of, why the special relationship is still out there and matters and is important and is relevant. But it's interesting. France, I think, is sometimes forgotten or neglected as our oldest ally and one of our closest allies. Certainly from a policy standpoint, I learned in government quickly, both of the Pentagon and the White House, just how valuable the U.S.-Franco relationship actually is. And I think with Macron's recent visit to Washington, it was interesting to hear him talk about common values and our history and how France looks at its relationship with the United States and the importance that it places on that. And so, yeah, sometimes the French, I think, unfairly get a bit of a bad rap. We like to tease each other a lot. But the truth is both France and the UK are certainly some of our closest allies.
I'd love to get your thoughts on the French reaction to the U.S. withdrawal from the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal. Especially Merkel had some pretty strident remarks in recent days. Could you tell us about those and give us your thoughts?
Yeah, I think for the first year that Trump was in office, I think the Europeans understood that we'd have some differences, but by and large, policy would continue along the lines of where it's been for many, many years. And they were willing to kind of turn a blind eye on some of the tweets that the president was churning out and just focus again on those policy choices. And for the most part, I think they liked what they saw. He's made significant investments in European defense and through the European Deterrence Initiative, and now is investing in all sorts of new NATO capabilities and initiatives, or at least his team is. But we hit a turning point when Trump decided to leave the JCPOA. I think it woke Europe up, and they started to understand that, in fact, this is a president that is willing to discount or disregard the advice of its closest allies. And he's willing to chart his own course and create friction in the relationship and to openly question the utility of the relationship. So now we have a very different situation in Europe where a number of our European allies are actually wondering where this relationship is headed. They see a president who is not interested in working with them on climate, not particularly interested in working with them on the future of the Iran nuclear deal, certainly raising a lot of eyebrows on where our trade relationship is headed, with some prospects of us getting into a trade war with Europe, and an open-ended question about how we're going to work together on Russia. So if you're a European sitting on the other side of the Atlantic right now, you're asking yourself, what future project will we be investing in as partners? I don't see a lot of prospects at the moment because this president is kind of turning the relationship inside out. So we went from a situation where there were some ruffled feathers last year with Trump's style and the finger wagging on defense spending, but they kind of expected that. Now we're in a different era where they really are, many of the Europeans are deeply worried about where we're headed as partners.
I find the German case to be particularly interesting in this sort big picture view, because, the French and the British are willing to make investments in defense, not where we'd like to see it, but still pretty significant investments in defense. They also share a pretty common view of the threat environment, along with the United States. And again, there's some differences, but generally the same. The Germans, however, are not willing to make these investments and are very reluctant, for obvious historical reasons, to see themselves becoming a real military power once more. Do you see that changing in the near midterm in Germany from the people that you're working with over there? I know you're about to go spend a year in Germany.
So I've been looking at German foreign and defense policy since the early 1990s, and I have seen some major shifts, and I think sometimes that's underappreciated. When you think back to Schroeder holding a no confidence vote to try and get agreement to send 3,000 troops into Afghanistan to work with ISAF, and the political risk he took at the time to do that, that was a major leap forward in German foreign and defense policy. So was Germany's participation in the Kosovo air campaign in 1999. We did not have a UNSCR for that mission. That was incredibly controversial for our friends in Berlin. And I think what we can say is that Germany is on a path towards taking a more assertive stance when it comes to foreign policy and defense policy. But no, they are not at a place where our friends in London and Paris are. They have not made proper investments in their defense. They know they need to do more. The problem right now for Angela Merkel is she's stuck between knowing that she's got to persuade her public and her cabinet that they've got to do more in the area of defense spending. And yet she also knows that because moving ever closer to Donald Trump is a political liability for her, she's not prepared to take any radical steps. She wants to meet Trump halfway. She wanted to meet Obama halfway when he raised this. I mean, Trump's not the first person to talk about German defense spending. And yet the situation has become worse for her and more politically charged, so much so that the German public actually doesn't want her to make a move because it would be doing a favor for someone that they don't hold in high regard. So I don't know what we're going to see in the short term. I think what we'll see in the long term is that Germany will continue slowly creeping up the list towards the, up their defense spending towards that 2% target. But will they make it by 2024, which is what everybody promised to do at the Wales summit? Probably not. They've got a long way to go.
When we hear things from German leaders like, we're not sure if we can count on the United States anymore going ahead, do you think that's sort of a backdoor way to increase defense spending, which is doing something that politically set the ground anyway for increasing defense spending, which is what Washington wants to see, but doing so in a way that is sort of seen as, we can't trust the Americans? So does that make sense?
Yeah, it's funny when Chancellor Merkel says stuff like that. She is often criticized here in the United States, particularly by the Trump team, for poking us in the eye and being too negative about the future of the relationship. I think it's misinterpreted. I think it's more along the lines of what you just said. I think she's trying to send a warning signal to her colleagues and the German public back home to say, look, we're not necessarily going to be able to count on the American security umbrella until the end of time. Therefore, we need to make the necessary investments. So I think folks don't always appreciate the messaging that she's trying to do at home. Sometimes people think she's just messaging us or the White House. And I agree that maybe her opening response to the Trump administration, emphasizing the values and all the rest, was maybe not the best approach in the beginning. But I do think right now what she's trying to do is to message her own people about the importance of making those investments.
From the talks you've been giving and the interactions you've been having with this new project, what's something that you wish more Americans understood about the benefits for Americans of our alliances?
Well, one thing that we've discovered as we've been out on the road is that the theme of burden sharing kind of shows up everywhere. It doesn't matter if you're meeting with a group of Democrats or Republicans or independents or young people or old people. there does seem to be this sense writ large across America right now that America is doing too much of something. Sometimes it's defense spending, sometimes it's development assistance. It varies. But as they think about that, and as they conclude that America is carrying too much of the burden, what I think sometimes Americans miss is the necessity to then double down your investments in partnerships and alliances and in allied relationships because of how it can help the United States and help alleviate some of that burden. Instead, we have this instinct to pull back and either move towards retrenchment or all-out isolationism, and that then misses the point because we're only creating a situation where fewer of our allies will be willing to step up and help us if we're not making those investments. I mean, I think what the president is doing right now is belittling and hurting our alliances around the world, both in Asia and in Europe, to a degree that we will live to regret that. You know, he wants us to pull back and not do as much, but he doesn't understand that by pulling away from some of those alliances, we'll have fewer hands to help us when push comes to shove.
One of the main animating principles of the Texas National Security Review is this idea of the need to bridge the gap between the scholarly and policy communities, or the scholarly and practitioner communities. Could you speak to that challenge specifically from your time in government and the work that you did, and how academic work either did influence the way people were thinking about something or was totally absent from a debate in a way that it could have been helpful in illuminating something?
Well, I think in your day-to-day job, wherever you might sit at the State Department, DOD, the White House, wherever, you're not spending a lot of time reading anything, reading short pieces, reading your IC briefs, reading the newspaper, reading reports from think tanks or academic studies. So first of all, the ability that you have, or the time you have to dedicate to thinking beyond the next 2 hours of your day, it's extremely limited. So that therefore limits the ability for outsiders to have any influence and impact. On the other hand, what we did do sometimes in government is we would invite outsiders to come in the case of my experience at the White House, we'd do little roundtables sometimes with the vice president and invite a mix of scholars, former policymakers, some academics, and those sessions were very helpful. Often we would do them before he took off on a trip or was about to make a major decision. That can be just life-saving in terms of bringing in someone who can share deeper insights and years worth of work, but they have to present their ideas in such a way that a policymaker can really digest them and utilize them. Unfortunately, I've seen too many cases where someone comes in with this real long brief, and the way they present it is just such a mismatch for the audience that they end up kind of flatlining and missing an opportunity to really shape policy. So not only do you have to have the depth of knowledge that policymakers so desperately need when they're in the middle of a crisis of any kind, but you have to have the ability to deliver your ideas in a way that's easily digestible and can range from 5 minutes to 50 minutes. And so it's tough. The gap is ever present as a policymaker, and you sometimes feel guilty that you don't have more opportunities. The last thing I'll say is, when you're out of government and you're sitting at a think tank, of course, then as a former policymaker, and perhaps someday some of us will be future policymakers again, who knows, but you have that opportunity to kind of tank up, and then interacting with the academic community and the think tank community is really important, so that next time you go into government, if there is a next time, you'll bring lots of fresh ideas.
And just to close out, you're going on a little bit of an adventure with you and your family over the next year. Could you tell us about that?
Sure. In July, I will be packing up with my husband and 2 kids and heading off to Berlin, where we will spend a year as a family. I have received the Weizsäcker Fellowship from the Bosch Academy, which is right downtown Berlin, and my husband is a career civil servant with the U.S. government who will be on detail for the year, and we couldn't be more excited.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma. Do not forget to check out the Texas National Security Review at TNSR.org.